Son of the Storm Dragon by Ashton K. 423. I Ren Daisuke thought my unconventional life would end after years of working in Special Forces and CIA, so imagine my surprise when I died and was reincarnated as a dragon of all things in this world filled with magic and monsters. This is the story of my adventures in the greatest journey of all time, under the new name Rimuru Tempest. Tensura AU Chapter 21. War in the Wetlands Lake Sis, Lizardmen Territory. Throne Room Trainee looked over all those that were gathered today in response to the collective threat of the Orc Lord and his army, a threat that was less than 24 hours away from their current location. Thanks in part to Trainee, her sisters, and the rest of the Dryads, they had managed to gather a sizable force in order to fight against the Orc army. Each of these was represented by the individuals in this room right now. The first were the Goblins and Hobgoblins. They were being represented by Rigard, Kataki, and a few other unnamed goblin chiefs. Aside from the goblins that served under Lord Rimmeru, numerous goblins from dozens of villages had also been enlisted to aid with the upcoming war. This brought their total number to about 15,000. Though the unnamed goblins may not be able to offer much in terms of raw power, Akatsuki and Abaru believed they could play a role in tactical warfare, and thus Trainee allowed it. The next were the Ogres and Kijin, represented by Akatsuki, Benimaru, Hakuro, and 3 ogre chiefs from other ogre villages. Though far and few between, there were multiple ogre villages within the forest. The difference was that none of them were quite as civilized or intelligent as the ones from Akatsuki's village. Surprisingly, the ogre clans they had gathered had all chosen to have Akatsuki be their representative in the war meeting. Most likely, this was a result of finding out that he had evolved from an ogre and had already earned the blessing of Lord Rimmeru. Regardless, Trainee could see the other ogre villages joining under Lord Rimmeru after all this. All in all, the ogres numbered around 3,000, and that included 25 Kijin named by Lord Rimmeru. The other 10 Kijin, such as Sakura and Shuna, had been tasked with protecting the refugees at the sealed cave and evacuating the forest should the worst come to pass and they fail here. After that, there were the rabbit folk, a race of demi-humans with rabbit-like ears and tails on their heads. Some seemed to have ears that went straight up, and others seemed to have ears that looped down towards their front. They lived along the river close to Lake Sis in a village of approximately 1,200. Though they often chose to live in peace and rarely sought conflict with others, they still took up arms and decided to contribute to the coming war, with a total of 850 choosing to fight in the coming battle. Then there were the Lizardmen, who ruled the wetlands of the great forest of Jura and had control of the largest water source, Lake Sis itself. Long ago, a legendary warrior rose among them that acquired a unique grade weapon called the Vortex Spear. Said warrior then went on to unite the various Lizardman tribes under him, and together, they managed to acquire Lake Sis as their territory. Their military might numbered 20,000 strong, the largest well-trained force currently available within the alliance. Among them, 220 had been named by Lord Rimmeru, with 200 becoming Dragonoots and the other 20 becoming Dragoons, greatly contributing to their aerial force. They were being represented by Abaru, Soka, and 3 others from the Lizardmen Council. After that came the merfolk, an aquatic humanoid species that dwelled within the waters of the forest. They had a few settlements on land as well, but they spent most of their time in the water. The Dryads and merfolk had some respect for each other that stemmed from the desire for preservation of nature. While the Dryads protected the land, the merfolk protected the waters from contamination and pollution using their life magic. One such example was the water pollution that came from the armed nation of Dwargon. The merfolk often purified those waters before it could spread and reach the depths of the forest, protecting its ecosystem. Their military might numbered around 2,500. Like the ogres, the merfolk were B-rank monsters with a specialty in water-based skills and life magic. A rare few even possessed the ability to manipulate sound to a small extent. Then came the bovoids and equinoids. These 2 species were A-rank monsters that lived on the eastern side of the forest. The 2 shared traits in that they were both large humanoids with bestial traits. However, the distinction came in that the former had the head of a bull while the latter resembled an anthropomorphic horse. These 2 species were as stubborn as they were proud and had long since refused to accept the Dryads' rule, refusing to acknowledge them. The only reason they were here was because they had tried to attack the orcs head-on, despite the warning of the Dryads, and had faced significant losses as a result. When Trainee had learned of this, she had been absolutely furious. Her aura flared and her anger was felt by all those around her. Even the Bovoid and Equinoid were forced to acknowledge her superior strength in that moment. Still, Trainee forced herself to calm down. They still needed more allies for the upcoming battle. The Bovoids and Equinoids totaled 600 in their contributed military might, but it could have been higher had they not been foolish. Next came the Elves. Helping them had been a bit difficult seeing as they lived scattered all over the eastern side in small settlements, but the Dryads had managed to reach out to most of them. Elves were relatively peaceful in nature and preferred to keep to themselves, enjoying the land as it was. That being said, there were many skilled archers and warriors among them, and even more individuals who were adept in various forms of magic. Their aid would prove to be a great boon in the coming war. Their military might numbered 500 total, but they also had 25 healers and support casters for additional aid. They were being represented by an elder by the name of Valen, along with 3 others. And then came the Tengu, a village of high-ranking monsters that had made their home in the Kusha Mountains. Trainee had been relieved to see that the negotiations for their aid had gone well, having sent a total of 30 men along with the matriarch of the race herself. While the numbers themselves weren't much, the Tengu more than made up for it with quality and strength, and the presence of Kaide was a great sign of things to come. Besides, the Tengu had an overall population of about 350, so sending this many warriors was already a huge contribution given the threat of fray they worried about. Kaide would be representing them in this meeting, who was currently seated with Hakuro near Akatsuki and Benimaru. Lastly were the Dryads themselves. Aside from Trainee and her sisters, there were 35 others among them. Though they often didn't manifest and chose to lay dormant within their dryas trees in their domain, Trainee hated having to wake them, but the situation demanded all the hands they could get. Their strength on average was high A rank, with a few such as Doris and Tria being on the low special A rank and Trainee herself being a solid special A rank. This made them a force comparable to the Tengu. All in all, their numbers rounded up to around 38. 5k against the 200k army of orcs that was marching to their location. The odds weren't that bad. 1 to 5 was more than manageable enough. Now that everyone is present, let us begin the war meeting, Trainee said, her voice echoing in the cave walls as all became silent and turned to her attentively. From what we have gathered thus far, the orc army numbers 200,000. And thanks to Sue and Apito, we were able to confirm that there is indeed an orc lord leading them. As it stands, they'll reach the marshlands within a day and a half at most. Our goal is to intercept them and kill the orc lord before it becomes any stronger, before it evolves, Trainee said firmly as she looked at those in attendance with a firm gaze. Understand that this is not a war to annihilate all the orcs, but rather a mission to eliminate the orc lord before he grows too powerful. Several individuals in the room nodded their heads in understanding. If they could kill the orc lord, the rest of the orcs would be weakened and reverted back to their natural D-rank strength. At that point, they would have no choice but to surrender or be wiped out completely. If that's the case, then I believe only a select team should confront the orc lord directly, while the rest of our forces hold back the orc army, Akatsuki suggested. Yes, that's most likely for the best. Swarming the orc lord with numbers would only result in unnecessary casualties, which would also serve to feed him and the orcs surrounding him. We need an assault team, Trainee nodded her head in agreement. But the question now is, who will confront the orc lord? Abaru asked, as the room became silent once more. Naturally, only the strongest would be able to confront and possibly defeat the orc lord. So choosing a team to move forward was basically claiming those chosen were the strongest among them all. Let me go at that, pig. As long as I'm on this assault team, the orc lord will be defeated. The chief of the Bovoids said smugly as he stood up, puffing his chest. As if, you'll probably drag the rest of the team down. Take me instead. I'll ensure our victory before we suffer any heavy losses. The Equinoids chief shouted in protest as he stood up, mocking the Bovoids chief while praising himself. Before anyone knew it, a full-blown argument had erupted between the two as they butted heads. Though they refrained from an all-out fight, their insults and shouts filled the cavern walls. Many of those present couldn't believe that these two were actually village chiefs, while the elven elder could only sigh, his people having long since been victims to the grudge of these two powerful species. Enough, Trainee shouted, her usually calm demeanor breaking, as vines erupted from the ground between the bovoid and equinoid leaders, swiftly wrapping around their necks. Have you two already forgotten that, thanks in part to your foolishness, the orcs have already gained the powers of the bovoids and equinoids? Pitting you against the orc lord would be foolish with that in mind, Trainee said in irritation. She really wished she could unleash divine judgment on these fools, but at the very least their manpower would be enough to hold back the orcs. If the orc lord hadn't been hiding behind his army, there's no way we bovoids would have lost to such lowly pigs. The bovoid chief shouted in self-defense, the equinoid chief nodding along in agreement. Both were slightly cowed by Trainee's anger and aura but were still stubborn enough to stand up for themselves. Indeed, we mighty equinoids would have been victorious had the orc lord not been a coward. The battle would have been as good as won. The equinoid chief also shouted. The rest of the monster leaders could only look at the two of them with dumbfounded expressions, wondering just how the two tribes had survived this long with leaders this foolish. In the end, one could only attribute it to their immense strength. For despite their clear lack of intellect, the bovoids and equinoids were among the most physically powerful monsters in all of Jura. Fools. This is the exact reason why the dryads tried to evacuate you. This is war. Why would the orc lord put itself at risk when it can gain power through its subordinates? It's a rather simple and straightforward strategy, Akatsuki pointed out as he sighed in annoyance. What did you say, you damn ogre? The bovoid and equinoid chiefs roared simultaneously in anger. I am merely pointing out the obvious. These orcs are beyond reasoning, and the unique skill, starved, is the cause. The orc lord will use any and all means necessary to sat its hunger, even through its subordinates. And I am a Kijin thanks to Lord Rimmeru, not an ogre anymore, Akatsuki said coldly as he made eye contact with both of them without fear, undeterred by their attempts at intimidation. There were much bigger concerns at the moment rather than dealing with these two fools, not to mention the gap in power between them had been closed since he evolved into a Kijin. Akatsuki is correct. My sisters did try to warn you about the orcs. But out of pride, you still confronted the orcs, making them stronger. Besides, something tells me you two are not well suited for teamwork. So no, you two will not be part of the assault team, Trainee sternly scolded both chiefs. The two chiefs grumbled as they took their seats once more. As much as they wanted to argue, they at least understood that they had made the situation worse due to their selfish acts and thus had no room to bargain. Now to get back on topic. Lady Trainee, if I may. Abaru started, prompting Trainee to nod, allowing him to speak. I believe my people would be best put to use on the field rather than confronting the orc lord. This is our territory and nobody knows it like we do, Abaru stated. Agreed. However, I would recommend keeping almost all the dragoons and dragonutes more focused on either fighting the stronger orcs, like the orc generals, or aiding the Tengu in fighting from above. We have to exploit the aerial advantage against these invaders, Akatsuki suggested, his expertise in warfare kicking in. I do not mind, and I agree. My dragonutes and dragoons will be best suited in exploiting such a unique and pivotal advantage rather than simply fighting on the ground with the other lizardmen. Though my daughter Soka and her direct subordinates will likely be better suited in aiding Sue and the rest of his unit in scouting and setting up traps and ambushes, Abaru said while looking at his daughter, since Soka and her direct subordinates in the Lizardmen Elite Guard were among the few to have evolved into dragoons upon being named, upon which they had joined and trained under Sue. Soka nodded in agreement with her father, knowing her expertise in the terrain and her training under Sue made her better suited for this than simple direct combat or aerial attacks. While we Tengu are no less adept at fighting on the ground, our greatest strength would be to attack from the air, especially given our current foes and limited numbers to contribute. Though I personally will fight by my husband's side, Kaide agreed while placing a hand on Hikaru's shoulder, drawing a warm smile from him. Then we are in agreement. The lizardmen will be charged with helping fend off the orc army and they will lend aid to the rest of the allied forces in making use of the terrain, Trainee stated while turning to the other leaders present. The goblins will aid in scouting efforts and setting up traps for the approaching orc army, and will also act as bait to lure chunks of the orc army into ambushes set up by either Sue's unit or our main army. The rabbit folk will also assist in said efforts. The elves who aren't focused on close combat will use their expertise in archery and magic to attack from a distance or use healing and support magic to support our main forces. Trainee's words drew murmuring and nods in agreement from the aforementioned races. Hey, what about us, Dryad? The Bovoid chief yelled in annoyance, with the Equinoid chief also nodding in agreement, wondering why they weren't mentioned. I was getting to you in a moment, Trainee calmly replied, not letting her annoyance and anger at the foolish behavior of the two races adversely affect her better judgment. The Bovoids and Equinoids will work alongside the Lizardmen, Goblin Riders, Elven Warriors, Ogres, Merfolk, and Kijin to form the bulk of our offensive force, with the Lizardmen ensuring that they can use the terrain to maximum effectiveness. Chiefs Akatsuki and Abaru will lead the combined forces. What? Why do we need to follow a lowly Ogre and Lizardman as our leaders? The Equinoid chief angrily complained, drawing glares from Akatsuki and Abaru while an annoyed expression appeared on Trainee's normally serene face. Akatsuki and Abaru will lead the main forces for 3 reasons. First, their people form the bulk and most skilled of our combined forces, with the Lizardmen being most familiar with the marshlands due to it being their home. Second, both have proven to be extremely competent, wise, experienced, and level-headed leaders who can be trusted to lead the forces with their best interests in mind and make best use of them with minimal casualties. And lastly, both of them were specifically chosen by Lord Rimmeru himself to lead the alliance in his place in the off-chance the great forest of Jura was attacked while he was gone until his return, Trainee retorted. And we are not ogres or lizardmen. I am a Kijin, while Chief Abaru is a dragoon, Akatsuki coldly reminded them while placing a hand on Benimaru's shoulder when he noticed his son getting annoyed, with Abaru doing the same with Soka. He was a little annoyed too, particularly since it was obvious he and Abaru weren't ogres or lizardmen anymore, but he knew better than to let his pride or anger adversely affect his better judgment, especially at such a critical time. And what about us? Rito suddenly asked, drawing attention to him and Sumair, which made sense since they were the only humans, and otherworlders, present. Both were naturally surprised to find each other in the forest since they weren't expecting to see other humans, let alone otherworlders, since they immediately recognized they were both Japanese by their respective appearances and names, but quickly got along nonetheless. Both of you are on par with high A-rank monsters and clearly possess skills, with Kataki informing me that you in particular have a unique skill called Supporter, Trainee noted, since Rito made no effort to hide his unique skill from the goblins given how often he used it to help them. It's true, Kataki said, speaking up. While he is still lacking in experience, Rito has learned well and his ability has made him an invaluable ally. I believe it will be of great help in the assault against the orcs, Kataki said with a nod, as a surprised Rito turned to the evil goblin. All he got was a smirk and a nod of acknowledgement as Kataki sat back down, having said his piece. And Lady Sumair's strength is truly impressive as well. Having seen her hold her own against Shion in a sparring match, I have no doubt she'll contribute greatly in the coming confrontation, Akatsuki said with a nod, resulting in Sumair's face flushing from embarrassment at the sudden praise and attention from those present. Very well, if you two would lend us your strength in the battle against the Orc Lord, we would greatly appreciate it, Trainee requested. You can count on me, Rito said with a nod. He was definitely nervous, but Kataki believed in him, that he could contribute greatly in a battle against an opponent as fearsome as the Orc Lord. And so he chose to believe in himself as well. He would make Kataki proud, both as his friend and his student. I understand. We will do our best to eliminate the Orc Lord and his Orc generals, Sumair replied, admittedly feeling rather nervous since she knew how dangerous the Orc Lord could get, especially if it evolved into an Orc disaster, but knew that if it wasn't dealt with soon, the consequences would be even more severe for both the great forest of Jura and the surrounding nations. She was confident in her ability to handle herself thanks to her unique skill, Overcomer, which helped her adapt and gain strength in the face of adversity, but she wasn't sure if that alone would be enough against the Orc Lord. So it's decided. The assault team tasked with dealing with the Orc Lord will be Benimaru, Shion, Rito, Sumair, and myself. My sisters and my fellow Dryads will assist Sue's unit and the rest of our main forces in reducing the numbers of the Orc army or minimizing casualties on our side, along with protecting and supporting the elf healers and supporters, Trainee stated. This declaration drew looks of understanding and agreement from those present, though the Bovoid and Equinoid chiefs still looked rather annoyed, but knew better than to disagree at this point. The aforementioned team all made eye contact with each other, an unspoken understanding of the responsibility and stakes of the situation at hand. With that said, there is one more thing that I wish to add before we conclude this meeting, Trainee said as the air around her grew heavy, catching the attention of those present. Given the nature of the enemy we face, we must destroy any and all corpses on the field. Be it that of our enemies, or our own. Under no circumstances can we leave nourishment to further strengthen the orcs, Trainee said, the weight of her words crashing over all the leaders present. One by one, they slowly nodded their heads in acceptance, knowing that Trainee was right, even if the thought of not burying their comrades was a very bitter pill to swallow. This was not a normal enemy, nor a normal war, and thus the rules of engagement would obviously be abnormal as well. Each of the leaders knew they needed to inform their kin of not only the need to destroy the bodies of their enemies, but to be prepared to have their own bodies destroyed if they die in battle, and possibly inform family members of such a condition, since it meant they couldn't bury their fallen. They could not afford to fail, nor afford to fall. They had to prevail no matter the cost, or at the very least needed to hold off the Orc Lord and minimize casualties until Lord Rimmeru's return. Armed nation of Dwargon, Cainit Mountains, Rimmeru stood in front of the gargantuan gates that had drawn him not long after he recovered from the battle with the spatial Dragon Lord. He could feel something within pulling at his core, something familiar, yet distant. Well, here goes nothing, Rimmeru thought to himself as he pushed the large doors open, with some slight effort. As soon as the doors parted, a bright light momentarily blinded Rimmeru, forcing him to cover his eyes. However, his vision quickly returned, his eyes widening as he looked at the source of the light. Before Rimmeru was a massive dome-shaped magical barrier similar in size to the one that held his mother in the sealed cave. And within the barrier was a massive black dragon that was slightly smaller than the storm dragon in size and had a powerful magical presence to match. Though this dragon appeared to be asleep or at least unconscious, like it was in a deep hibernating state. Whoa! This has to be the second largest dragon I've seen since my mother. And its aura is immense too, several times greater than the Dragon Lord or even my own right now, Rimmeru contemplated in concern as he walked into the large chamber where the sleeping dragon was resting. A part of him couldn't help but wonder if finding powerful sealed dragons was going to become a trend, but he also couldn't help but be curious about what type of dragon this was. I wonder what you did to warrant being sealed away so high in the mountains, not to mention being put to sleep on top of that. It must have been something pretty bad. Rimmeru slowly approached the barrier containing the dormant dragon. Despite its immense aura, it wasn't quite as powerful as his mother, and yet despite that, the restrictions of its sealing implied that it was just as dangerous and destructive as she had been, if not even more so. And yet, despite its sleep-like state, Rimmeru could still feel a myriad of powerful emotions emanating from it through desire. And what he felt was a heavy amount of grief, hatred, longing, loneliness, and an intense anger. Is it wrong that I feel bad for this dragon? Rimmeru thought as he looked at the large beast. While he didn't know the exact details related to the dragon, his own personal experiences with his mother made him a little sympathetic, since nobody would enjoy being imprisoned for who knows how long and would likely only build up negative emotions like the ones he sensed from this dragon. Aside from that, there was also a strange connection that he couldn't help but feel with the dragon. Not just emotional, but something physical, almost as though some part of him was resonating with the dragon. This was strange, since he hadn't felt anything like that while he had been hunting all sorts of dragons throughout this trip. Open double angle bracket answer. Analysis of the target has confirmed that its presence is vastly superior to your own and that of any dragon lord. Furthermore, no cognitive functions have been detected, implying the dragon has a severely damaged soul or lacks a will of its own. The emotions emanating from it are likely instinctive in nature or remnants from its past life. Close double angle bracket, I see. If it lacks a will, then it's probably not a good idea to try and release it, Rimmeru noted, glad to have gotten the heads up before he ended up trying to free it only for it to go on a rampage. If it possessed sentience and a stable soul, then he would likely do so, but he realized letting it go when it was being driven by pure instinct would only cause havoc for the Cainit Mountains and the surrounding nations, territories, including Dwargon and the Great Forest of Jura. Though feeling the magicules, dragon aura, and dragon factor the sealed dragon was emitting, Rimmeru still couldn't shake that feeling of familiarity that was coming from it. Hey, great sage, what about the aura coming from the dragon? There's something oddly familiar about it. Open double angle bracket answer. Analysis of the aura has confirmed that the target's dragon factor shares some similarities with yours, suggesting a potential familial relation. Close double angle bracket. Wait. Are you saying that there could be some kind of connection between me and this dragon? Rimmeru asked mentally in shock, his eyes widening as he looked at the large dragon in a new light. Open double angle bracket affirmative. However, as it is, the dragon's soul has been severely damaged, thus rendering it nothing more than a mindless beast. Close double angle bracket, right. The excitement that came with the prospect of finding a potential relative was snuffed out by the reminder that they were essentially brain dead. There was nothing that he could do for the dragon with his current abilities. That being said, another idea made its way into his mind. Hey, great sage, you said its factor was similar to my own. Does that mean I can devour it and store it in my stomach, like I did with my mother? Rimuru would have loved to know this relative had the opportunity allowed it, but it seemed fate had other plans. Still, it would be cruel to just leave this dragon tucked away with its negative emotions festering like this. If a time came when someone released it, it would be bad news. The best option was to devour it like he had his mother, dismantle the barrier containing it, and make its power his own. He would lay it to rest within him, just as he had done for Shizu and Masayuki, rather than letting it rot here. It was the least he could do for it. Rimuru wouldn't deny that the power he'd gain was also a perk. He had no doubt devouring this dragon would not only make him several times stronger but would also grant him several powerful skills. But it wasn't just about power. Open double angle bracket affirmative. There is still a vast amount of storage left within stomach. Close double angle bracket. Alright then, let's do it. Rimuru thought, before extending his right hand towards the large dome-shaped barrier. Immediately, a black torrent of energy shot out and began to engulf the barrier. Apex Predator began to consume the sealed dragon and the barrier surrounding it, compressing the large structure until it vanished into Rimmeru's stomach. When the power of the unique skill dissipated, the sealed dragon and the barrier were gone, as if they had never existed in the first place. Open double angle bracket beginning analysis of the barrier surrounding the creature identified as the Chaos Dragon. The barrier seems to be efficient for containing monsters, further analysis required. Despite its efficiency, the barrier is far less complex than the Unlimited Imprisonment containing the Storm Dragon Veldora. Current estimated time until analysis is complete is 19 months, close double angle bracket. That fast, huh? Well, it's certainly much better than the analysis of Unlimited Imprisonment, which is supposed to take up to a century, Rimmeru thought. It was a much better deal and would give Rimmeru time to adapt to the power he had gotten from the Dragon Lord before gaining more strength. After all the power in the world was useless unless one learned to use it properly. That's where things like experience and techniques came in. And considering that beings could live for hundreds to thousands of years or even forever in this world, that already put Rimmeru at a disadvantage against most major powers. His only hope of covering the gap in the short term was to gain more power and skills, along with some semblance of mastery over them. Rimmeru was just about prepared to leave the cave and return to the great forest of Jura. He had spent a large amount of time here already and was more than satisfied with the progress he had made in his training. His magicules had drastically increased by almost 12 times the amount he had before arriving at the Canid Mountains. His proficiency with storm magic and the development of his Ryujin-style arts were also coming along great, with Great Sage informing him that the acquisition of mana manipulation now allowed him to use magic with drastically increased efficiency, control, and overall power. This made storm magic significantly easier to use at full strength with minimum destruction or wasted power, with the Ryujin style also drastically improving as well. He'd also gained a ton of elemental and dragon-based skills from the various types of dragons he had devoured before the Spatial Dragon Lord. All in all, the trip was worth it. Just as he was about to turn and leave, he stopped upon realizing something. Despite the brightness of the barrier that had kept the dragon vanishing, the chamber was still well illuminated. Prompting him to look up at the ceiling and along the walls of the chamber, he was surprised to see numerous glowing magic ores along the walls, ceiling, and even on the ground along the cave's edges. He was easily able to identify the magic ore and magisteel, which Rimmeru already had a large reservoir of in his stomach, but aside from those, Rimmeru was able to also detect a few ores that were of an even higher quality and higher magicule concentration than pure magisteel, with some of it even generating something akin to draconic aura. Man, this really is like exploring the sealed cave all over again, except on a much smaller scale. Not only did I find a dragon, but there are tons of ore here as well. Though what are the materials with an even higher magicule concentration than magisteel, or the ones generating a draconic aura? Rimmeru thought in wonder. The only difference was that this place wasn't as big as the sealed cave. Otherwise, there might have been a lot more magic ore and potentially magic herbs as well. But unlike the sealed cave, this chamber wasn't an intricate network of underground caverns. If Rimmeru had to make a comparison, he'd say it was slightly bigger than the very bottom of the sealed cave where his mother had been located. Open double angle bracket answer. The cave appears to be rich with massive amounts of magic ore and magisteel, likely due to constant and heavy exposure to magicules from the Chaos Dragon for hundreds or even thousands of years. The time and level of exposure resulted in some of the magisteel further evolving into a higher grade ore. Further analysis within the stomach will be required to identify its properties. Would you like to use Apex Predator to devour the ores? Close double angle bracket. Yes. No way I'm going to pass up such an amazing jackpot. This is literally a treasure trove of rare goods. Rimmeru thought with glee as he outstretched his hand once more. The iconic black torrent of energy devoured all the ores along the chamber walls, ceiling, and ground. He couldn't help but feel a bit excited and curious about the higher grade ore that Great Sage had mentioned and was more than looking forward to the results of the analysis. He had no doubt that they would be able to create some amazing items and weapons from those materials. In his past life, Rimmeru had attended enough political events, usually as a bodyguard and part of the security, to know the value of rare goods when he saw them. And as proven when he was in Dwargon, magisteel sold for a very high price. He literally made a small fortune just by selling 2 ores of pure magisteel, and to think he had hundreds more in his stomach was just absurd. Adding a little bit more from this chamber would benefit him, especially the higher grade ore he had found. In his past life, he had seen plenty of delegations or political meetings go down, though he didn't have any experience in the field himself. That was something he was going to have to work on if he wanted to be a competent leader for the nation he planned to build. But more than that, he would need money and unique resources that only his nation could provide. He already had plenty of magisteel and healing potions that he could use to initiate trade with nations that were interested, which would go a long way into funding the building and establishment of his nation. And he also planned on arming his own people with high-grade weapons and armor, since one never knew when war might come upon them, from either humans or demon lords. King Gazel had already shown some interest in his vast reservoir of magisteel and healing potions, which was why Rimmeru felt a little guilty about essentially stealing this treasure trove of magical materials from Dwargon, since the Canate Mountains were technically in their territory. But he quickly got over it, since King Gazel largely relied on the Canate Mountains as a defensive structure due to the rugged terrain and the dragons living here serving as a deterrent against invasions. He highly doubted King Gazel would go this deep into dragon territory for these materials, no matter how valuable, given the risks and dangers it would pose to his people in mining or transporting it. And let's face it, what King Gazel didn't know wasn't going to hurt him. Okay, looks like that's everything, Rimmeru thought to himself as the last of the ore was absorbed, leaving the cavern as dark as night without the luminous ores. With that, Rimmeru began to make his way out of the cave where Zijin and Ranga had been waiting for him, the two of them having opted to stay out due to the immense magical energy of the Chaos Dragon. I should probably head back to Jura now. Any more hunting and I'll bring more attention to myself than necessary, especially since King Gazel might be a potential ally in the future. All in all, this trip was a huge success. Rimmeru had improved in his arts and skills, acquired new skills, gotten several times stronger than before he came to the mountains, and had even acquired some high-quality materials. The Chaos Dragon would be a feast for another time. He looked forward to the skills and abilities he would gain from devouring it. However, the feeling of accomplishment and success was immediately quashed when a thought communication connection was suddenly established. Lord Rimmeru, are you there? Please respond. The voice that echoed through Rimmeru's mind was unmistakably Doris, and just from the sound of her distress and desperation, he could already feel a pit forming in his stomach. Doris, I'm here. What's wrong? Rimmeru replied urgently, his voice firm with a hint of concern. Lord Rimmeru, thank goodness. I've been trying to reach you for some time now. Doris said in both relief and slight exasperation, though the distress in her voice was still very audible. Lord Rimmeru, we need you to return to the forest immediately. An army of over 200,000 orcs has entered the forest, and worse, they're being led by an orc lord. An orc lord? Rimmeru asked out loud in alarm. He had heard about this monster from Akatsuki and Hakuro prior to the ogres swearing to him. The topic had come up when they were discussing his apex predator, and they mentioned its similarities to the orc lords, starved. The key difference was the scope of the skills. From what Rimmeru had been told, all those under the orc lord were under the effect of starved, allowing them to gain the abilities of those they devoured. And on top of that, the orc lord devoured the fear and anxiety of all those beneath him, making his army even more formidable. If such a large army of devourers truly was invading the forest, then it was no wonder why Doris had been desperately trying to reach him. The question was, why had it taken her so long to do so? Open double-angle bracket answer. It can be surmised that the presence of the Chaos Dragon and the vast amount of magicules and dragon factor in the Canaan Mountains caused interference that made establishing communication difficult. Close double-angle bracket. I guess that explains why she was able to reach me after I dealt with the Dragon Lord and devoured the Chaos Dragon, Rimmeru thought to himself, before focusing on the link between him and Doris. Doris, what's the situation right now? How is the Alliance? The Alliance is holding up well for the time being. Trainee has taken command and has prevented them from confronting the orc army to prevent unnecessary losses and the empowerment of the orcs. As it stands, the orcs are marching towards the marshlands of the lizardmen, where Trainee is planning for a final confrontation, Doris explained, and Rimmeru couldn't help but nod in approval at the plan Trainee had come up with. When it came to an opponent who grew through devouring their foes, it was better to just risk it all in a single battle. Furthermore, my sister has been enlisting the aid of numerous species across the forest. But there's a chance that may not be enough. What do you mean? Rimmeru asked. We have strong evidence suggesting that Gelmud may be the one instigating the orcs. Rimmeru's eyes narrowed into slits at the mention of Gelmud. He still hadn't forgotten about that Majin and the role he played in the deaths of Shizu and Masayuki. And now he was causing even more trouble. Rimmeru regretted letting him go that first time when he first encountered Zijin and Apito. Has he made an appearance? Rimmeru asked. For as much of a clown as Gelmud had been, his power was still above even that of the Kijin and Dragoons. This made his presence an equally significant threat to the Alliance. For a moment Doris hesitated before speaking. He attacked the ogre village a few days ago, but fortunately, they were able to repel him. Not too long after, an army of 15,000 orcs began marching in the direction of the village. Trainee managed to convince the residents to evacuate, but the ogre village was destroyed, burned to the ground. For a moment, everything was silent as Rimmeru processed this news. Then his aura suddenly exploded in all directions. Ranga and Zijin pushed back by the explosive force and intensity behind it. Master, Ranga called out as the pressure from the oppressive aura grounded him. Just as quickly as it came, the aura vanished as Rimmeru reined it in to avoid hurting them. I'll kill him. Slowly and painfully, Rimmeru muttered lowly, so low the likes of Ranga would have missed it without their sensitive ears. His voice was as cold as ice and devoid of all warmth, such that even Ranga could not help but pity the individual who had earned his master's wrath. Doris, I'll be there shortly. You can fill me in on the rest then. Understood. Please hurry, Doris said with one last plea before the connection was cut. The gravity of the situation made apparent to Rimmeru. Open double-angle bracket notice. Would you like to use the technique, spatial motion, to teleport to the marshlands? Close double-angle bracket. The sudden question dragged Rimmeru out of his thoughts. Spatial motion, a technique under his newly acquired, spatial domination, extra skill, basically allowed him to teleport to any location he had been to before, as long as he could envision the location or map out the coordinates. Fortunately for Rimmeru, he had Great Sage for the logistics of it. As long as he had been there, Great Sage could take him there. Ranga, Zijin, I need both of you to get into my shadow. We can't get to the forest fast enough by flying or even through shadow movement, but luckily I got a new way for us to get there quickly, Rimmeru declared, deciding to put his faith in Great Sage's ability. Both Ranga and Zijin nodded in understanding before sinking into his shadow. All right, Sage. Take me to the marshlands, Rimmeru commanded his unique skill. With time, he hoped to be able to use this skill on his own, but now wasn't the time to be testing out new skills, so instead, he would leave it to his trusted partner. Open double angle bracket understood, initiating teleportation to the lizardmen's marshlands. Close double angle bracket. A glowing, intricate magic circle appeared on the ground directly beneath Rimmeru. A bright light erupted from the circle, engulfing him. When the light vanished, Rimmeru was gone, his presence completely vanished from the Canate Mountains. Great Forest of Jura, Lizardmen Marshlands. The sun had fallen over the horizon, leaving the clear dark sky above the forest lit by the glow of the full moon and numerous stars. And yet despite the beautiful view above, all was not as peaceful as one would hope for such a night. For beneath that starry sky, a great battle was taking place in the wetlands of the great forest. Trample all, trample all. The strength of this comrade we eat is now ours. The strength of our foe is now ours. Trample all, trample. The battle cries of nearly 200,000 orcs could be heard all across the wetlands as they clashed with the allied forces that had a lesser number of nearly 40,000. Overseeing the battle from a vantage point was Trainee and the rest of the assault squad, which consisted of Benimaru, Shion, Sumair, and Rito. They were holding back for the time being to preserve their strength for the battle with the Orc Lord once it had been located. The war had been raging for nearly 40 minutes now. When the orcs initially marched into the marshlands, the allied forces had been prepared, separated into various groups with numerous traps set to displace and disorient the orcs so they could be handled more easily even by the weaker members of the alliance. As soon as the traps set by Sue, his group, the lizardmen, and the merfolk had been triggered, and the cohesiveness of the orcs had been momentarily disrupted, the allied forces charged in at full force. But given the sheer size of the orc army, only a third of the army had been directly affected by the traps set. As Trainee had suspected, the orc army had been empowered by the unique skill, Starved, to the point where they could even be considered low A-ranked monsters, not to mention they had a variety of skills, abilities, and resistances from the various monsters they had devoured on their way to the marshlands. Some of them even had their appearances slightly altered to match their acquired skills. The change was significant enough that the goblins, who normally would have been on the same level as the orcs, were struggling to hold their own. B-rank monsters, such as the ogres and merfolk, had to put in more effort than they would against what was supposed to be a weaker species. The ranged spells and skills being cast by the elves and monsters capable of ranged abilities also provided support and helped keep the enemy from overwhelming the allied forces due to their numbers. But some of their effects were reduced due to the resistances acquired by the orcs. Still, the damage was significant, and the orcs were cautious of them. The only ones with a clear advantage were those of a rank and above, namely the Kijin, Dragoons, Tengu, and Dryads. They were dealing substantial damage to the enemy ranks, but it wasn't quite enough to turn the tide of the battle. They would sooner tire out before the orcs were wiped out. Surprisingly, the Bovoids and Equinoids were also holding their own despite their power having been mimicked by the orcs, but that was mainly due to their experience as warrior species who had been at war with each other. As I thought, the only way to truly end this war is to defeat the Orc Lord, Trainee thought as she surveyed the battlefield. The allied forces were fighting strong for now, the higher-tiered monsters tearing through the enemy ranks while the rest of the allied forces took advantage of the chaos. Still, they were severely outnumbered and for the most part outclassed. They wouldn't last in a battle of attrition. Then, in that moment, as if her very prayers were being answered, "Lady Trainee, we have located the Orc Lord." Sue's voice suddenly echoed within Trainee's mind. He was communicating through thought communication, and an image of the Orc Lord and his location was transmitted into her mind. It wasn't just she who had received the message, though. All the members of the assault team had received the news. Benimaru and Shion were naturally excited and determined to face the powerful foe ahead. They had been getting rather impatient watching the ongoing war and wanting to jump into the battle themselves. But they understood their roles and thus had not acted rashly. Sumair and Rito seemed a bit nervous, more so the latter than the former, but they were both just as determined to do their best and contribute to the fight ahead as much as they could. "It's about time, Sue. I was getting rather tired of just waiting," Benimaru responded with a grin as his hand went to the hilt of his blade, his eyes emitting an ember glow for a brief moment. "That's quite deep into the enemy lines. Getting to the Orc Lord won't be easy," Sumair said out loud, though her words were also communicated through thought for those not physically present. "Ha! As if that would stop us. Xian said confidently with a grin on her face. Our goal is to defeat the Orc Lord no matter what. If any of those pigs get in our way, then we'll just have to tear them apart. He. Well, she's certainly excited, Rito said nervously, clearly not sharing in Xian's enthusiasm. But she makes a valid point. We don't have any other choice but to go straight ahead. Taking a detour around the army would only prolong the conflict, which is not ideal for our side, Benimaru explained as he turned his gaze back to the battlefield. Then it's decided. We'll head right through the Orc army and straight for the Orc Lord, Trainee said. Abaru, Akatsuki, Valen, do you think you can create a path for us? This wouldn't be an easy task. She was basically asking them to open a path into the heart of the enemy, but the assault team needed to preserve as much of their strength as possible for the fight ahead. Abaru was leading the aerial division, which consisted of Dragonutes, Dragoons, and Tengu, since Kaide was fighting on the ground. Aside from attacking from the sky, they also had a secondary duty of disposing of any corpses on the battlefield before the orcs could devour them, regardless of whether it was an ally or enemy that had fallen. This was mainly done by using the flame breath of the Dragonutes and Dragoons. Akatsuki was leading the main army on the ground against the orcs, while Valen, the Elven Elder, led the magic users and archers that were dealing ranged attacks from afar. Leave it to us, Lady Trainee, Akatsuki said firmly, the other two division leaders giving similar responses with equal determination. Everyone understood what needed to be done and what was at stake, and they were all willing to put their lives on the line if it would ensure their victory. That was the life of a warrior, to live and die on the battlefield. Thank you. Gratitude was the only thing Trainee could offer them at the moment. She then turned towards the rest of the assault team members, her eyes burning with resolve and a fierceness not common in them. Let's go, she said, getting a firm nod from them all. Tempest wolves instantly leapt out of their shadows. These 5 had been set aside for this exact purpose. In the event that the Orc Lord was at a distant location, they would quickly carry the assault team over to it. With their speed, they would reach the Orc Lord within minutes. The assault squad mounted their respective wolves, and with a loud howl, the Tempest wolves leapt towards the war zone. The final battle was nigh, and the fate of all folk within the great forest of Jura would be determined by its outcome. Meanwhile, on another part of the battlefield, 2 blades could be seen glinting in the moonlight, moving and slashing through their foes with precision and speed unlike any other, their wielders moving with just as much grace and fluidity. When one looked upon them, they would never believe that the two had not seen each other in a little over 300 years. And yet despite this, they still knew each other inside and out, they still moved and fought as one. Blood was splashing and enemies were falling in what could only be called an artistic display of death. These two were none other than the Sword Savant, Hakuro, and the Goddess of the Mountain, Kaide. They were the only 2 students of the legendary Byakura Araki and masters of the Haze-style sword technique. Many of the surrounding allies had been drawn to a pause as they watched these 2 master swordsmen cut their way into the enemy lines. Their skills were nothing short of legendary in their eyes, their movements barely visible. I see that you have not lost your touch over the years, my love, Hakuro said fondly as he cut down yet another orc, flicking his blade to the right to rid it of the blood staining it. Ha ha ha, surely you jest. Even now your technique is vastly superior to mine, Kaide said with a mild laugh. The ogres and goblins fighting alongside them could not help but look at the old pair as though they were senile to be having a casual conversation in this scenario. Maybe so, but these old bones of mine aren't what they used to be. I just don't have the stamina to keep up with these young fellows anymore. My experience and skill are all I have left to offer, Hakuro said as he dashed between another 2 orcs, his body a blur as he cut them down instantly. I'm not faring much better myself. Almost all my magic power was transferred to Momiji when I birthed and named her. I'm just a shell of the so-called goddess my people once knew, and my condition will only worsen with time, Kaide said softly. Despite having only a minuscule amount of the once massive magic energy she used to have, Kaide was still a formidable warrior. Though all she had to offer now was her blade and her waning physical strength, with time that too would vanish as her condition worsened. I'm glad I got this chance to fight beside you once more. I believed the only thing left for me was to pass on my knowledge to Momiji and then await my death. How happy I am to have been wrong. It is I who am the Blessed One. Living past the natural age of my kin, living long enough not only to see my wife once more but to meet the daughter I never knew I even had. I could ask for no greater miracle than this, Hakuro said with a smile that held warmth and gratitude, even in the midst of such a bloody war. 2 days ago, during the short time he and Benimaru had been at the Tengu village to enlist their aid, Kaide had introduced Hakuro to his 16-year-old daughter. She was the child Kaide had carried within her for the past 300 years, the fruit of their love from that one fateful night under the maple tree. Meeting his daughter, Momiji, for the first time had been nothing short of wondrous for the elder Kijin. There were no words to describe it. The girl resembled her mother in so many ways, her white hair that went red at the tips and her golden eyes that held strength and passion behind them. Their interaction had been brief but joyful. Momiji had been just as happy to finally meet her father, and in that moment Hakuro found yet another purpose to live, to keep on fighting. He had lived his entire life by the sword, honing his blade to perfection and passing on the teachings of his grandfather to the rest of his people. After Kaide, he never dreamed of the possibility of finding love again or having a family of his own, nor did he want to. Kaide had been the only one for him. But it seemed the heavens had yet to abandon him. He had lived far longer than any other ogre, he had received a name, and he even carried the family name of his grandfather. His evolution had helped him regain his youth and extended his lifespan, and now he was reunited with his wife and had met the daughter he never knew he had. Having lived his life by the sword, Hakuro wanted to experience the joys of being a husband and father, of living in the same home as his wife and daughter, helping raise and teach Momiji, and passing on his own experiences. That was the future he couldn't stop seeing ever since they left the Tengu Mountains, a dream he had never dared hope for, and yet now it was within his grasp. They just had to win and survive this war. Ah! Hakuro and Kaide immediately turned their heads towards the source of the anguished screams and saw 2 ogres being held by 2 crimson serpent silhouettes. The serpents were originating from a rather large orc with black armor plating and armed with an axe and shield. The screams of the ogres grew louder as their skin and flesh began to break down and decompose right before everyone, the 2 succumbing to a rather gruesome death as they were devoured by the serpents. The 2 recognized the orc as one of the orc generals that Sue had spoken of in his report about enemy forces. It was certainly bigger than most of the orcs and had a much stronger presence, placing it at high A rank in terms of magicule capacity alone. To think that mere ogres would be causing us such trouble, the orc general spoke, his presence making most of the ogres and lizardmen present wary. Once it was we orcs who feared you due to our weakness, but no longer. Under the guidance of our lord, we have risen above you, and your strength will become ours. Hakuro could not help but frown at the disgusting sight of the orcs' arrogance. It seemed as though the orcs truly were starting to let the power of starved get to their heads. Perhaps it was the effect of the orc lord devouring their anxiety and fear. Kaide, would you care for one last dance with this old man? Hakuro said to his wife of 300 years with a smile. He was very much aware that with Kaide's condition, this may very well be her last time on the battlefield. Just being here was already straining her body, which barely had the magic power to support itself, but she had chosen to fight today because she wanted to fight by Hakuru's side one last time before she put down the sword for good. It was something Hakuro intended to honor and make memorable for her. Nothing would make me happier, my love, Kaide responded with a beaming smile before the 2 turned towards the orc general and approached it, blades drawn and ready for action. The orc general saw their approach and turned to them in intrigue. Oh, so you approach me, do you? You must covet death badly, it said arrogantly as it readied its weapon and shield. I'm afraid we will not be the ones dying today, Hakuro said as he drew his sword. You and your folk have made a grave mistake in attacking these lands. I would tell you to leave, but I know you are beyond reason. Enough of this pointless drivel. Your attempts at intimidation won't work on me. The orc general yelled as 2 crimson serpents were released from its backside and launched towards the elderly couple. Hakuro and Kaide dashed forward, their movements swift and acrobatic as they dodged the serpents' attacks, their blades cutting across the ethereal bodies. The serpents swiftly reformed and attacked them once more. But this didn't stop their advance, and they were quickly approaching the orc general. Once they were within range, Hakuro suddenly vanished from his position while Kaide suddenly accelerated, her figure becoming a blur as she swiftly cut through the ethereal serpents of the rot skill and made a beeline for the orc general. The orc general raised its shield, blocking Kaide's strike to the left, before sensing danger coming from the opposing end. It swiftly swung its axe just in time to counter Hakuru's blade, which had been aimed at its neck. Had it been a second later, the orc general would have died instantly by decapitation. "Oh, you sensed that, did you?" Hakuro said as a single eye opened. He was truly impressed that an orc had been able to sense his approach despite him having used Formhide to conceal his presence and Flash Step to reposition himself. "It seems you're rather perceptive for an orc, or is it the work of one of the many skills you stole from your victims?" Hakuro and Kaide leapt back, putting some distance between them and the orc general. They stood side by side, blades drawn, ready to face this challenge. Meanwhile, on another part of the battlefield, another orc general had made an appearance, tearing through goblins and lizardmen alike with its vastly superior strength. The allied forces on the scene were quickly losing ground to this monstrosity and the surrounding orcs. Unlike the first orc general, this one wielded 2 large machetes, and its body had rock-hard, spiky skin which rendered the attacks of the goblins and lizardmen useless. It was the body armor skill of the Amorsaurus that Rimmeru had encountered within the sealed cave, basically boosting the orcs' resistance to physical attacks. "Damn it, our attacks aren't doing any damage to that monster. We have to fall back and let one of the stronger species deal with it. I can't believe these filthy orcs are giving us this much trouble." "Ah!" The nervous chatter of the hobgoblins and lizardmen was broken by another blood-curdling scream as another hobgoblin was cut down by the large orc before being devoured by the surrounding orcs in a gory display. "To think a bunch of lizards and goblins would dare stand in our way. What a pathetic notion. If you surrender now, I can promise you a swift death before we devour your corpses. Refuse, and we'll eat you alive limb by limb," the orc general said as it pointed one of its machetes at the opposing forces. "Tch, this bastard. Does he really think we'll roll over and die?" one of the lizardmen cried in defiance, several others shouting in agreement. They knew they had no hope of winning against this vastly superior opponent, even with their numbers, but they still had their pride as warriors. "Fools," the orc general muttered, as a group of lizardmen and hobgoblins charged towards him with their weapons. 3 Chaos Eaters sprouted from its backside and charged toward the incoming group. "Hold it!" The sudden war cry was accompanied by the severing of the ethereal serpents by a heavy slash from above. The charging goblins and lizardmen slowed as their savior landed on the ground in front of them. The goblins were especially surprised when they saw who it was. "I'll handle this foe. You guys focus on the rest." The individual who had intervened in the nick of time was none other than the evil goblin. Kataki. His dark eyes focused on the towering orc general as he readied himself for the difficult fight ahead. Even though he was far stronger than the hobgoblins, he had his doubts about whether or not he could face a monster of this caliber on his own. Regardless, he could not stand by and let more goblins die at its hands. During the direwolf raids, he had been too weak to protect his village, his people, and his family. As a result, he was the sole survivor of that village. Even though he didn't interact much with the hobgoblins of the current goblin village, mainly due to the Tempest wolves that also lived there, he had sworn to himself that he would protect them. He would use the power granted to him by Lord Rimmeru to fight for all goblins within his reach. Even if it cost him his life. "I won't let you claim any more goblin lives, you foul pig," Kataki spat with venom as he held his weapons, his voice burning with rage. Triggered by his intense hatred, the Berserk sub-skill of the unique skill, Avenger, was activated, and a dark, ominous aura surrounded Kataki. The unique skill, Avenger, had a total of 4 sub-skills. Analytical Appraisal analyzed one's foe and their abilities. Copy allowed the user to copy the skills and abilities of their foe, though for Avenger, it could only be triggered in the face of defeat and only one skill could be copied from an individual. Berserk drastically increased the user's power based on the amount of anger and hatred they carried, though if not handled with caution, the user could lose themselves in their rage. Lastly, Retaliate was a skill that increased the user's power when fighting against foes that had once defeated them. It also had the added benefit of slightly increasing the user's natural resistance to attacks that caused their defeat. "So you're my opponent?" the orc general asked, clearly displeased as he didn't view a single goblin as a threat. "Very well then. Come, goblin. I'll make quick work of you," the orc said, much to Kataki's irritation. That's what you think. In an instant, Kataki was upon the orc general, much to its surprise, swinging his axe toward its head. But he was forced to reposition when two Chaos Eaters sprouted from the orc's back and lunged toward his airborne form. Kataki clicked his tongue as he swung the machete in his other hand, using the momentum to rotate and slam his foot down on one of the ethereal serpents before it could tear into his flesh. Using its form as a stepping stone, he pushed forward, cutting through the other serpent before charging the orc general once more. Kataki brought both his weapons down on the orc general, but this time it was prepared. The orc crossed its large blades in front of it, and a second later, Kataki's weapons crashed against them, a shockwave emanating from the point of impact. Your strength is impressive for a mere goblin, but... Kataki's eyes widened as the orc general pushed him back. You'll have to do a lot better than that to even have a chance. With no ground to hold onto, he was launched and sent soaring through the air. But before he could go far, something grabbed his cloak from the back of his neck, before slowly putting him back down on the ground. Thank you, Kataki said in relief as he turned to the person who had caught him. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw that it was none other than the matriarch of the Tempest Wolves, Raya. Are you all right? Raya asked, her voice surprisingly soft and gentle. But Kataki didn't hear her. Instead, his vision went red as the images of his former village appeared in his mind. He heard the screams of his people as the direwolves tore through them mercilessly. The grip on his weapons tightened considerably, and the ominous aura around him thickened as a result of berserk, feeding off the negative emotions in his heart. Kataki, I know I have no right to ask you to forgive the sins of my kin. Raya started. The females and young hadn't been part of the raids, but that didn't matter. To any outsider, all the direwolves were somewhat responsible, and Raya understood that much. She only hoped Kataki would consider the current situation before doing something reckless. But for now, please channel that hatred toward our common enemy. If not for yourself, then for your fellow goblins. Quote. For a moment all was silent, and it seemed as though Kataki would lunge at Raya at any moment. But then, the evil goblin took a deep breath and turned away from her, instead focusing his rage on the orc general before them. Shut up. Don't tell me what to do. The ominous aura coming from him was a clear sign of the raging inferno within, made manifest through the berserk skill. Raya understood that Kataki held a deep hatred for all wolves, but she was glad that in this moment, he had decided against acting rashly. Turning her head to the orc general, Raya growled as a soft wind swirled around her feet. Even if Kataki didn't want her help, or to be in the same space as her at all, Raya would still lend her aid in this fight. This foe was too powerful to be left to Kataki alone. Perhaps this was simply Raya trying to atone for the sins of her kin, she wasn't sure, but it was a step toward bridging the gap between Kataki and her pack. Goblins and dogs teaming up. I don't think I've ever seen a more pathetic pairing, the orc general taunted as it approached them. Do you honestly think the two of you stand a chance against a superior Majin such as myself? You filthy orc wouldn't even have this power were it not for the orc lord, were it not for the countless monsters you slayed. That power is not yours. Kataki shouted with a snarl. He then cast a glance toward Raya. As much as he hated to admit it, the likelihood of winning this battle on his own was low, and as much as he loathed working with a wolf, the current situation was beyond personal feelings. Try to keep up, he muttered, receiving a bark in response from the matriarch. He had no doubt she could hold her own. Raya's strength was beyond that of the Tempest wolf pack. Based on magicules alone, she certainly had more power than him. With that, he dashed forward as another clash began. With the Orc Lord, Geld, that was the name that the Orc Lord had received from its master. And with it, an intense hunger gnawed at its being, its stomach, a dark, never-ending abyss that longed to be filled. This was a result of the unique skill, Starved, a skill that granted Geld the power to consume and absorb the power of others, a power that had been passed down to all that followed him. And because of that, they too felt his endless hunger. They too marched forward with the sole purpose of devouring this world. And yet, Geld knew what they were doing was wrong. Despite orcs being known as gluttonous creatures, they were rather mild for monsters. What they were doing now, raiding species after species and devouring them, this was not their true nature. But the endless hunger caused by starved clouded his mind and judgment. There was no other desire other than to consume everything around him. The orcs themselves had already fallen into the abyss of starved, and had no choice but to keep moving forward. "I'm so hungry," Geld muttered slowly. He was vaguely aware of the current situation, the war in the marshlands he had led his people into and the resistance of the various species that had joined forces against them. But all of that was overshadowed by this never-ending hunger that demanded he eat something, anything. "My lord," one of the two orc generals beside him, his son, to be exact, called out to him as the two of them rushed to stand in front of him protectively. It was only as Geld raised his head and looked beyond them that he realized they had company. 5 individuals, riding atop wolf-like beasts. 2 of them were clearly human. 2 others were ogres, no, Kijin. And the last was surprisingly a dryad, one of the caretakers of the forest appointed by the storm dragon Veldora herself. Each of them had considerable power, comparable to or higher than Geld's generals. "So that's the Orc Lord. His presence truly is formidable," Benimaru commented as he eyed Geld, who stood behind the 2 orc generals. He had to admit that the Orc Lord was rather large, and its aura was truly something. The last time he had felt something close to this was when he had earned the ire of Lord Rimmeru before he left to end the direwolf raids. "HMPH, it's just an overgrown pig. Nothing to be so overly cautious about. I'll cut him down to size and turn him into a wonderful feast for Lord Rimmeru upon his return," Shion said enthusiastically as she drew her blade. Benimaru and Trainee, knowing of Shion's cooking, couldn't help but sweat drop at the thought, while Sumair and Rito wondered if a monster such as the Orc Lord was even edible. Even if her cooking skills have improved under the guidance of Shuna and Lord Rimmeru. Benimaru thought as his eyes shifted from her to the Orc Lord, who'd want to eat something like that. He doubted Lord Rimmeru would be all too eager once he knew the source of said feast. Trainee turned back to the enemy before them, her expression hardening as she stepped forward ahead of the group. She too could feel the power emanating from the Orc Lord, but she believed with the party present, they could face this threat and prevent it from becoming something beyond their grasp. This land had been entrusted to her and her sisters by the great storm dragon Veldora herself, and for centuries, they had done their best to protect and oversee it, even if some of the stronger species wouldn't follow their rules. But more than that, this was the land that Lady Veldora had prepared and nurtured her child within. It was the land where Lord Rimmeru would establish himself and create a nation unlike any other. A nation where beings of various species could coexist peacefully. More than anything, Trainee wanted to see that vision realized. To see the future that Lady Veldora's heir envisioned come to fruition. And to one day witness the return of Lady Veldora herself, as she and her child met without boundaries. But none of that would be possible if they fell here today. If the foundation Lord Rimmeru had worked so hard to establish crumbled before it could grow and expand further. That was why failure was not an option. No matter the cost, they had to defeat the Orc Lord here and now before it could grow further. "Orc Lord," she called out to the large pig, getting its attention somewhat. It was clear that the effects of starved were eating away at its consciousness. This was what happened when one didn't have the spiritual power needed to hold a unique skill. They were slowly consumed by it until they were driven by sheer desire. In this case, it was an endless hunger. "I am the Dryad Trainee, the primary caretaker of the great forest of Jura. You and your army are trespassing on the domain of the storm dragon. Take your people and leave at once, and we may look past the blood you have shed in these lands." At this point in the war, there was no way things could be settled peacefully, but Trainee felt she at least had to try diplomacy as a means to avoid further conflict and losses. For a solid minute there was no response. The only thing that could be heard were the cries of war around them and the sounds of steel clashing against steel. And then Geld moved. He took a single, ground-shaking step forward, and the entire strike team was immediately on guard. Sumair and Shion immediately took the front position, their blades readied for battle. Benimaru was behind them with his own blade, and Trainee and Rito were at the rear. This formation had been created to maximize their abilities as much as possible. Shion and Sumair were confirmed to be strong close combatants. Shion, with her overwhelming strength and her Hercules edge, was a devastating force that proved unrivaled among her kin in terms of physical prowess. Sumair, with her sword and shield, was a capable close-range combatant who had even managed to hold her own against Shion in a sparring match for some time. Benimaru was a close to mid-range combatant, his black flame skill, which he inherited from Lord Rimmeru, allowed him to produce deadly flames that would vaporize any enemy in its path. Then there was Trainee herself. She mainly specialized in spirit magic but was not unaccustomed to close combat. Still, she positioned herself in the rear to play to her strengths and support those fighting up close. She also had the secondary task of protecting Rito, the least experienced fighter of this assault team. Lastly came Rito himself. Though one may not expect it, he was quite literally the glue that would be holding this group of fighters together. His unique skill, Supporter, would play a huge role in ensuring their cohesion, not to mention the other supportive capabilities it held. The unique skill, Supporter, focused on enhancing the overall capabilities of allies, ensuring seamless coordination and maximizing the overall strength of the party. The skill was comprised of 5 sub-skills: Analyze and Assess, allowed Rito to analyze his target, getting a reading on their skills and combat styles. Augmentation, allowed Rito to channel his own energy to boost the physical or magical abilities of his allies. The type, level, and duration of the enhancement depended on the energy invested. Heal, allowed Rito to heal his own injuries or those of others. The greater the wound, the higher the energy drain. Cure, allowed Rito to cure negative status effects on himself or allies. And Synergy, the core ability of Supporter, enabled seamless coordination and situational awareness between the user and their allies. It allowed party members to fight with the synchronization of veteran teams that have fought side by side for decades. Of the chosen members of the assault team, only Benimaru and Shion knew each other well enough to function as a team. But Rito's unique skill not only increased their abilities but allowed them to make proper use of their collective strength. "I'm so hungry," Geld said as he continued walking toward them. "Come here, and let me devour you." The Orc Lord suddenly dashed forward with a shocking amount of speed for a monster its size, vanishing from its position. It suddenly appeared right above Sumair and Shion, its large cleaver in hand, its shadow covering them. The two girls leapt back as the behemoth descended, swinging its large blade and striking the ground where they had been standing a second ago. A large dust cloud formed at the impact zone, completely covering the Orc Lord. "Look out!" Benimaru shouted just as Sumair and Shion touched the ground, landing a bit away from the dust cloud. In that moment, 2 crimson ethereal serpents shot out from the dust cloud, heading for Shion and Sumair. Shion grinned at the incoming serpent and charged forward, the ground beneath her cracking from the pressure of her step. Moving with incredible speed, Shion charged for the Orc Lord, cutting through the head of the ethereal serpent with a vertical slash as she continued her charge. Meanwhile, Sumair was approaching from the opposing end, having cut down the serpent that had been launched her way. Geld momentarily glanced at the charging girls flanking him from both sides, before dashing for Shion. The violet-haired Kijin was much more prepared this time around, though. She wouldn't underestimate his speed just because of his size. Greatsword and cleaver clashed as their wielders made contact, a shockwave emanating from the sheer strength of the exchange. The two crossed blades in a surprisingly fast flurry of strikes given the size of their weapons. Shion's smaller form allowed for more mobility in her strikes, but the Orc Lord had the strength to properly wield its cleaver to block and counter all of her moves. However, as the exchange continued, Shion quickly began to lose ground. Geld's strikes proved to be stronger than her own, and his reaction speed much better than one would expect from a monster of his size. Then again, this fight was never meant to be easy. That was why Shion had allies. "I'll help," Sumair shouted as she suddenly appeared in the air behind the Orc Lord, her blade glowing with a blue aura. Geld spared her a glance, and Sumair felt her instincts warning her of incoming danger. She quickly released her technique and brought her shield in front of her. "Aura Guard," she shouted as her shield began to glow with a bright green color and a barrier instantly materialized. That turned out to be the right choice as the Chaos Eaters erupted from Geld's back and shot towards Sumair, even as he kept his attention on Shion. The Crimson Serpents crashed into the barrier, and given her position in the air, Sumair was pushed back significantly. She landed on the ground some distance back, but the ethereal serpents followed, not giving her the time to gather her bearings. However, before they could strike at her defenseless form, Benimaru appeared in front of her, and with a single swing of his flaming blade, cut all 3 Chaos Eaters down. "Are you all right?" he asked as he turned back to Sumair. The young girl was still surprised by the display of strength from the Red Kijin. Shaking her head, she quickly regained her composure, Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for the assist, Sumire said as she stood up, ready to jump into the fray once more. Turning her gaze back to the Orc Lord, she noticed that Xian was still engaged in close quarters with the large beast. It seemed Trainee, who had summoned the wind spirit Sylphid, was also lending her aid from a distance, using wind blades or plant-based attacks to create openings for Xian. The Orc Lord was visibly taking damage but was healing just as quickly through self-regeneration. At this rate, it would heal from any damage they did until it ran out of magicules, which wasn't likely to happen soon given its power. Their best bet was to create opportunities to land significant strikes and deal considerable damage that would force it to use most of its magicules for regeneration. Fortunately, with Rito's supporter boosting their abilities and providing healing, they would be able to hold their own even in a battle of attrition. Think nothing of it, Benimaru said with a nod as he helped her to her feet. With a wordless nod, the two turned back to the battle and ran toward the Orc Lord. Xian could feel her arms starting to sting from the relentless strikes of the Orc Lord. She'd managed to avoid taking severe damage, thanks in part to the assistance of Trainee and the healing and buffs provided by Rito, but at the same time, any attacks they managed to land on the Orc Lord were quickly healed. As much as she hated to admit it, she couldn't hold her position for much longer. It was only a matter of time before the Orc Lord broke through her defenses. Geld's cleaver swung toward Xian once more. However, the Kijin blocked the devastating attack with her own large blade, her feet digging into the ground as she was pushed back a few meters. She felt the impact of that strike deep within her bones despite blocking it. Just as Xian was about to charge in for another clash, numerous vines suddenly shot up from the ground around Geld, binding him and firmly holding him in place. "Xian, get back!" The Kijin heard Trainee shout. She didn't even question it and instantly leapt back. "Hell Flare!" Benimaru yelled as he launched the compressed black flame toward the bound Orc Lord. On contact, the attack exploded into a large sphere of explosive black flames that engulfed the Orc Lord, its cries heard from within. "Do you think that did it?" Benimaru asked, though he already had a feeling as to what the answer would be. "I doubt it. If it were that easy, I would have been able to handle the Orc Lord myself," Trainee responded as the flames subsided, leaving a cloud of smoke and dust. Through the cloud, the shadowed form of the Orc Lord became visible, immediately putting everyone on guard once more. The cloud eventually faded to reveal Geld's form, burns and injuries on various parts of his body, but the injuries were already beginning to heal and close up. "We dealt damage, and his regeneration seems to be a bit slower than it was before," Trainee noted, noticing the decreased recovery rate. "The constant healing is eating away at his magicules. If we can wear him down some more, all it would take is one major strike to end him." "Xian, take a break and gather your strength," Benimaru said as he turned to the purple Kijin. He could tell she had pushed herself in the recent confrontation. Her breathing was heavy and her hold on Hercules' edge was a bit shaky. While her body was in fine condition thanks to healing from Rito, her fatigue from defending against the onslaught of the Orc Lord was a different matter altogether. "Right, thank you." As much as Xian wanted to argue that she could still fight, even she knew she couldn't afford to be reckless. She would take the small reprieve and jump back into the fight as soon as her body was capable of moving the way she wanted it to. But still, this fight was a major lesson to the Kijin. She still wasn't strong enough. She had to aim higher. If monsters like the Orc Lord existed, then there were others just as powerful. The Tengu and Dryads were already examples of superior species. If she truly wanted to be Lord Rimmeru's bodyguard, she would have to get much, much stronger than she was now. Otherwise, she would only be a hindrance. "Lady Sumire," Benimaru called out as he charged forward at the Orc Lord. The young girl responded with a firm nod as she quickly followed after the young master. They wouldn't wait for it to fully recover. It was best to strike while the iron was still hot. Using Flash Step, Benimaru vanished and appeared right above the Orc Lord, his blade drawn and held above his head, black flames encasing the steel. He swung the blade down, only to be horizontally blocked by Geld. The flaming blade met the cleaver, the intense heat from the black flames making the larger blade red hot, but not quite enough to melt it. "Your pathetic flames won't work on me," Geld shouted triumphantly, but he was surprised when Benimaru merely grinned in response. The reason was soon made clear when he felt a sharp pain on his backside. He turned to see Sumire behind him with her glowing blade stabbing him. He could feel the deep gash in his back, and though the injury was already starting to heal, that didn't take away the pain and irritation of it all. 2 Chaos Eaters sprouted from his backside in response to the attack, lashing out at Sumair. The girl leapt back as the first serpent dived toward her, crashing onto the ground she had been standing on. She fluidly sidestepped the second serpent as it lunged at her, twisting her form and bringing her blade down on its body, severing it and causing it to vanish. Back with Benimaru, the Kijin had taken advantage of Sumair's attack to create some distance between him and Geld. He gave a glance toward Trainee, who nodded to the unspoken message, before charging back toward the Orc Lord. The two clashed blades as sparks went flying all over. But unfortunately for the young master, who didn't have the same physical prowess as Xian, Geld's strength quickly began to overwhelm him, and he was quickly put on the defensive. What a monster! How was Xian able to hold her own against this behemoth? Benimaru questioned internally as a vertical swing from the giant pig pushed him a few meters. The injuries he acquired from the brief but brutal exchange were quickly healed by Rito's abilities. While the exchange had indeed been one-sided, he had more or less achieved his goal of repositioning himself. To be more specific, he was now on the opposite side of Trainee with the Orc Lord right in the middle of them. With a grin, Benimaru focused his magic power once more and conjured Black Flame into the palm of his right hand. At the same time on the opposing end, Trainee and Sylphid were conjuring a large amount of spirit energy, the area around them becoming a whirlwind of magic energy. Geld, sensing a spike of energy from two different directions, unleashed 4 Chaos Eaters from his backside, 2 each going in opposite directions toward Benimaru and Trainee with surprising speed. Not on my watch, Xian suddenly yelled as she appeared above the crimson serpents heading for Trainee. With a single swing of her Hercules edge, she decapitated the serpents, dissolving them into energy. Meanwhile, on the opposing end, Sumair had stepped in on Benimaru's half, severing the approaching serpents with the sharp end of her aura shield, art. It seems it's my turn to thank you now, Miss Sumair, Benimaru said with a grin as the black flame above his palm began to radiate an even more intense heat from the compressed fire. He had spent a large amount of time training the volatile power of the Black Flame skill since acquiring it. Though the progress was small, he had managed to harness and refine this power to an extent, and now it was time to see the fruits of his labor realized. Be gone with you, Hell Flare, Benimaru called out as he unleashed the highly compressed sphere of black fire toward the Orc Lord. Meanwhile, on the opposing end, a bright green aura surrounded Trainee and the wind spirit Sylphid. Vortex Sphere, Trainee called out as she thrust both her arms forward, releasing a highly compact orb of rotating wind. The two attacks struck the Orc Lord simultaneously. The suction force from the Vortex Sphere pulled the Orc Lord right into the center of the attack with the force of a vacuum. What followed was a large but intense explosion of black flames that forced everyone to jump back due to the sheer force and heat of it all. The screams of Geld could be heard from within the attack as the combined strike not only burned but also cut into his flesh. Spirit magic, unlike most forms of magic, didn't rely on magicules, but it was instead the result of one directly manipulating the physical elements of the world and bending them to their will. That meant any form of magic resistance was pretty much useless against it. Meaning even if the Orc Lord possessed magic resistance, it wouldn't help against spirit magic. And while the same could technically not be said about Black Flame, due to it being a magic-based attack, the sheer heat of the compressed flames, not to mention their nature, made it so Hell Flare was effective against even those with fire resistance. It also helped that any form of wind-based magic tended to amplify the capabilities of fire-based magic, regardless of whether either form of magic was magicule-based or spirit magic. As the vortex-based explosion of wind and black flames began to dissipate, the Orc Lord was revealed to be still alive but heavily wounded and burned, crouching on a single knee. Its regenerative capabilities were clearly significantly diminished but still working overtime just to keep the Orc Lord alive, with limited success due to the slow regenerating of prior injuries and the black flames. Gah! Why, you? Geld growled as he tried to stand up without success, his injuries leaving him too weakened. Now's our chance. Finish this, Trainee said to the others, drawing nods of agreement as Benimaru, Xian, and Sumair drew their weapons and charged at their weakened foe. However, before they could reach their target, the three of them sensed a large aura rapidly approaching their location, bringing them to a halt. They looked up into the night sky to see what appeared like a crimson meteor rapidly approaching. The three were forced to ground to a halt and leap back as the meteor heavily impacted the ground they had just been standing on. How dare you? How dare you filthy monsters stand in the way of my grand master plan? The cloud of dust from the impact was blown away to reveal the angered form of Gelmud standing before them, an intense aura leaking from him. You damn fools just keep getting in our way. Why can't you just accept your fate and become food for Geld and his army? At least then, your meager lives would have served a purpose. Gelmud, you have caused too much trouble within these lands. First with the fire spirit Ifrit, then by trying to deceive and manipulate the monsters, and now by bringing an orc lord and his army into these lands, Trainee stated in cold anger as she stepped forward, Sylphid following close behind. Surrender now and Lord Rimmeru might be willing to grant you a quick and painless death or even show mercy again. However, if you refuse, I'll have no choice but to pass divine judgment upon you as Chancellor of the Forest. Gelmud, however, merely scoffed at the threat, not even bothering to take it seriously. Despite the unexpected turn of events, he still believed that things were still well within his grasp. You dryads and monsters just don't get it, do you? With the storm dragon now gone, there's now an enormous power vacuum within the great forest of Jura. Anyone of significant power would want to claim this vast land for themselves, Gelmud said with glee as Trainee's frown deepened. I'll commend you lot for coming this far. Not even I expected you to bring Geld to his knees. I wasn't supposed to interfere, but I can see that I have no choice now. Gelmud let out a low laugh as he slipped his hand into his coat. The members of the assault team quickly got into battle stances in preparation for an attack. But to their surprise, Gelmud didn't pull out a weapon, but instead pulled a dark crystalline orb, glowing purple with a large amount of ominous energy condensed within it. Fortunately for me, and unfortunately for you, my master provided me with a contingency just in case. It was meant to be used against that Majin, Rimmeru, was it? But to think I'd have to use it because of the likes of you. Geld, eat this and get up, you stupid pig. Before anyone on the assault team could respond, Gelmud threw the dark orb toward the still smoking Geld. The Orc Lord immediately caught the orb and swallowed it whole in one gulp. Almost immediately afterward, a massive spike of magical power surges from Geld as his body is enveloped in a large amount of magicules. The bursting magicules surrounded Geld and formed a black cocoon that completely concealed his body from the rest of the world, and yet despite this, they could still feel his power growing astronomically. This immediately alarmed Trainee and the rest of the assault team, as the massive surge in power and the magicules surrounding the Orc Lord's body only meant one thing. Conditions met. Confirmed. Initiating the individual Geld's evolution. The Orc Lord was evolving, a declaration which had been confirmed by the words of the world. It was the very scenario they had been trying to avoid. The worst possible outcome. Trainee and the others wanted to stop it, but it was unfortunately obvious that it was too late to stop the evolutionary process now, and Gelmud stood between them and the evolving orc leader. Within a minute, the cocoon began to crack, before it shattered with an explosive force that had the assault team grounding their feet. From the cocoon emerged Geld, who was now several times taller and his potbelly had flattened to reveal a chiseled and muscular physique, with an appearance closer to a giant than an orc. He let out a loud, ground-shaking roar that was heard all across the battlefield. Confirmed. The individual Geld has successfully evolved into the Orc Disaster. Geld was no longer an Orc Lord, but an Orc Disaster. Ahahaha! Behold, the newly evolved Orc Disaster and future Demon Lord, Geld. The new ruler of the great forest of Jura. Gelmud proclaimed dramatically as he pointed at Geld, the Orc Disaster. Rah! Geld roared once more as he unleashed a massive surge of aura and magical power that could be felt across the marshlands, his power now several times greater than before. My name is Geld, Geld the Demon Lord. The devourer of all things in this world. Geld proclaimed. As if Geld's evolution wasn't enough of a nightmare, more bad news kept on coming. As a result of the food chain, sub-skill from the unique skill, starved, the orcs under his influence were also affected by his evolution. While the orcs didn't evolve, their magical and physical capabilities were significantly boosted to the point of being twice what they had been before, their bodies glowing with a red aura as they pressed forward with their newfound power. This swiftly changed the tide of the battle. The Allied forces, who were previously holding their own or even gradually pushing back their orc opponents up until this point, were now being pushed back by the now stronger orcs. Worse still, it appeared that the orcs were now better adapting to any attempts to push them back, including developing fire resistance against the Kijin and Dragonutes, and water resistance against the merfolk's water-based attacks, among other things. Not even the magical or aerial support given to the Allied forces could provide much help as they were being pushed back onto the defensive just to survive. "Quick, everyone, we must do what we can to stop the orc disaster," Trainee shouted while trying to rally the assault team, drawing nods of understanding. They all knew it was unlikely they could beat the orc disaster now based on the power it was radiating, but they had to at least try. The gap in strength was immense, and there was no doubt that their odds were significantly lower now, but the fact remained that they needed to fight. "Limit break," Sumair declared as she activated the sub-skill of her unique skill, Overcomer. The unique skill, Overcomer, was the skill that Sumair had awakened upon being brought into this world. The skill had 5 sub-skills: Thought Acceleration, Analytical Appraisal, Adaptive Evolution, Danger Sense, and Limit Break. Adaptive Evolution allowed her body to adapt a lot faster than average to various circumstances or situations that would strain her body and mind. In some scenarios, she could even awaken a new skill or resistance based on the trigger. Danger Sense allowed her to detect any ill intent directed toward her. This could be in the form of attacks or mere hostility. Then there was Limit Break, a skill that allowed her to temporarily surpass all her limitations, be it physical, magical, mental, or even spiritual. However, it came at the cost of a heavy toll on her body, and it wasn't a state she could maintain very long. Limit Break was typically a last resort decision on her part given the extreme physical exhaustion she typically experienced afterward, but given the dire situation and Rito's support via supporter, it was now or never. "Shion and Benimaru, let's try to stop it." Drawing nods from both Kijin, the trio charged toward the orc disaster as Trainee tried to help by restraining it with vines erupting from the ground. Gelmud flew a small distance away from Geld and the approaching trio. He wasn't worried about Geld losing the fight. From his perspective, it was just a matter of time until Geld devoured these foolish monsters and added their power to his own. His assumptions were proven correct when Geld easily broke the vine restraints holding him in place and swiftly charged at Shion with his machete. His machete clashed with Shion's large blade once more, but unlike before, the purple Kijin was quickly overpowered by the orc disaster. She managed to block the follow-up swing by Geld, but the sheer force of the impact lifted her off the ground and sent her several feet back. "Lady Sumair, together," Benimaru said while channeling black flames into his katana, engulfing the blade in the unique flames, as he and Sumair attempted to slash the orc disaster together. However, it proved to be for naught due to Geld easily blocking both of their attacks with his own weapon before pushing them back with ease, even with Rito's buffs supporting them. The sheer level of growth since his evolution had drastically increased the gap of strength between them to an overwhelming degree. "Insolent bugs, you are getting in my way. Hopefully, you can serve as decent appetizers," Geld stated before launching 2 Chaos Eaters from his back toward them. Benimaru managed to slash through one without issue with his black flames, destroying it, but Sumair only managed to partially block the one aimed at her with her shield before being overwhelmed and blown quite a distance away to the ground. And to her horror, the effects of rot were slowly eating away at the clothes and flesh of her right arm. Though a combination of rapid regeneration and adaptive evolution, coupled with Rito's buffs and passive healing, not only prevented rot from causing any permanent damage but also gradually reversed it, it would take time to fully recover and it was unlikely she could contribute any further in the fight. "Lady Sumair," Trainee said in alarm before using her plant magic to lift the injured Sumair and bring her to Rito and herself. "I'm fine, or I will be," Sumair said as she grit her teeth at the pain. Her arm was slowly healing, but the pain of rot would linger until she was fully cured. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I'll be much use going forward," she added in frustration. With her right arm corrupted, she wouldn't be able to effectively wield her blade. If she got back into the fray, she would only end up being a burden to those on the front line. "Insolent pig, you'll pay for all of this. Just die already," Shion angrily yelled as she charged at the orc disaster before jumping into the air with Hercules' edge being lifted above her head, channeling her aura into the large blade for a devastating overhead slash. However, before her blade could even swing down for the devastating strike, Xian was suddenly grabbed midair by Geld's left hand, which firmly restrained her in place despite her struggles. For all her incredible strength, Xian found herself unable to break free from Geld's grip. Xian's efforts to free herself were further undermined by Geld's usage of rot, causing Xian to scream in pain as the skill was slowly eating away at her flesh and clothing. Ah! Xian's screams could be heard within the immediate area as the sizzling sound of rot eating away at her flesh and clothes could be heard by those nearby. HMPH, maybe you could serve as a decent appetizer, especially given that you wanted to kill and eat me as part of a feast, Geld mocked as he brought Xian closer to his mouth. Xian tried to struggle even harder, but the pain of her flesh being decayed and the superior strength of the orc disaster made it all but futile. Benimaru wouldn't make it in time to stop her from being devoured. Trainee couldn't attack or bind Geld without getting Xian caught up in it as well. Am I really this weak? Xian couldn't help but wonder as her head approached the open mouth of the orc disaster. She knew there were superior species out there, the Tengu and Dryads had been a clear sign of that, but to be killed by an overgrown pig, it was beyond humiliating for a warrior such as herself. And yet, that humiliation wasn't what was on her mind at that moment. I'm sorry, Lord Rimmeru. However, before she could be devoured by Geld, the left arm that had been holding Xian was suddenly severed from the rest of Geld's body. What? How? Gelmute exclaimed in shock, having expected a one-sided slaughter upon Geld's evolution, before his shock turned into anger at recognizing the familiar figure who caused it. You! Before Xian could fall to the ground, she was caught in someone's arms. When she turned to look at her apparent savior, her expression turned into a mix of shock and joy. After all, her savior was none other than the very individual she had been thinking of in what she had assumed would be her last moments, her lord and master, Rimuru Tempest. Sorry I'm late, everyone, Rimmeru's voice said, his black hair with streaks of blue dancing in the wind of the night sky and his emerald green eyes perfectly reflecting the light of the moon. In that moment, the pain from rot was forgotten by Xian due to the sheer joy and relief that she felt at Rimmeru's return. Lord Rimmeru, you've returned, Xian happily stated upon seeing her master once again, her eyes getting slightly teary in the corners. And not a moment too soon, given the current state of the battle or your current condition. Let me fix that for you, Rimmeru said before using rejuvenation, an extra skill he gained by combining greater heal and the analysis of the status healing effects of Apito's honey during his month of training, granting it far superior and faster healing capabilities. This was made apparent by the fact that the injuries and degradation of rot were fully reversed almost instantly. Rimmeru then teleported to the others, who had regrouped upon Benimaru and Sumair being blown back by Geld and the latter still recovering from her injuries, before Rimmeru set Xian down with the others. Thank goodness you have returned, Lord Rimmeru, Trainee said in relief, while Rito and Sumair looked in amazement at their savior, given that this was their first time seeing the current guardian of the great forest of Jura. I'm sorry for taking so long. I had gotten held up just before arriving here. But I'm here now to stop this invasion, Rimmeru reassured Trainee before looking around to check on those present. Trainee seemed fine for the most part. She specialized more in ranged attacks, so it was natural she had the least injuries. Benimaru was a little bruised, but nothing a potion could not fix. Xian was fully recovered thanks to rejuvenation. Lastly, Rimmeru turned to the two unknown humans that were with them. They were clearly allies judging by the fact that Trainee had been protecting them. But the more Rimmeru looked at them, the more he noticed some Asian features he saw frequently in his past life. Are these two otherworlders? Is this a result of another one of Gelmude's schemes, or were they sent here by another nation? Rimmeru couldn't help but wonder, this being the second time he crossed paths with otherworlders while dealing with Gelmude's schemes. He quickly shook his head sideways. Questions could wait until later. Right now, he had to focus more on the situation at hand, the orc disaster, its overwhelming army, and Gelmude. Open double-angle bracket notice. The female otherworlder is recovering from the effects of rot through a combination of rapid regeneration, heal, and an exceptionally rare and useful extra skill known as adaptive evolution, which allows the user to adapt to adverse circumstances or challenges by stimulating growth in physical and magical capabilities and overall magicule reserves, and in some situations allows the user to acquire new skills or resistances. The female Otherworlder appears to possess adaptive evolution as a sub-skill of a larger unique skill. More time and focus is necessary to fully analyze the unique skill in question, but the skill, adaptive evolution, has already been successfully acquired via copy, close double angle bracket. Wow, there is definitely more to these two Otherworlders than meets the eye. That skill definitely sounds extremely useful, both for any hidden surprises Gelmud and these orcs may have and in any long-term growth or challenges. Thanks, great sage, Rimmeru said while thanking his AI-like unique skill. He was tempted to use rejuvenation to help the girl fully recover, but Rimmeru had a feeling that the effects of adaptive evolution would allow Sumair to grow even stronger if she recovered via her own rapid regeneration and the passive healing buff she got from Rito, rather than if he instantly healed her with rejuvenation. Rimmeru then turned toward Geld and Gelmud. Upon seeing the latter, Rimmeru's eyes narrowed in rage as his eyes glowed an eerie green while he unleashed the full extent of his aura in a massive surge of power. Almost instantly, all fighting across the marshlands came to a halt as everyone turned in shock at the source of overwhelming power that could be sensed, with the assault team being no less shocked. The amount of power they felt coming off him was nothing like what they had experienced. Though Rimmeru had never truly released his aura in front of his subordinates, so even his previous limits were unknown to them. Even Gelmud and Geld were completely caught off guard by the power they felt coming off Rimmeru, with both actually feeling a sense of concern and foreboding upon sensing Rimmeru's power. No, it can't be. How can this insolent Majin be this strong? Gelmud thought in shock and frustration as he tried to process the current situation. They hadn't planned to face a monster with such an extreme amount of power, even with the additional precautions Clayman insisted on taking. Gelmud, I realize now that sparing you that day was the biggest mistake I've made since I came into this world. You've done nothing but cause me trouble since then. Corrupting Shizu and the fire spirit Ifrit, manipulating monsters within these lands, and now leading an army of orcs into these lands. I even heard you destroyed the ogre village I was staying at. But no longer. I won't make the same mistake twice. You will die tonight, but not before telling me everything I want to know. Rimmeru coldly declared as his rage could be felt by those who could see or hear him. Gelmud couldn't help but gulp from the immense pressure and killing intent that was being directed toward him. And who do you think you are, huh? Gelmud shouted in anger and a false act of confidence he wasn't sure he really had. Do you have any idea how frustrating it was to have you foil my plans over and over again? Do you know how hard I worked to bring this plan to fruition? How many seeds I sowed, how many beings were manipulated? Well, do you? Who do you think you are to stand in my way when my goal is so close? Rimmeru eyed Gelmud for a moment after the Majin's rant. His eyes were devoid of emotion. Bringing his hand to the hilt of his blade, he took a step forward, then another, and another. As he did so, he opened his mouth to speak once more. His voice was level, sound, and collected, and yet it carried the tone of finality and death. My name is Rimuru Tempest, guardian of the great forest of Jura and all who call it home. And you lot are trespassing in my mother's domain.